Hello and welcome back to the Happy Horse Nutrition Podcast. I'm Dr. Nerida, professional equine nutritionist and lifelong student of everything that goes on in a horse's hindgut. And this topic of our conversation today is one of the more frustrating conditions our horses seem to experience that stems from something going on in their hindgut, and that is free fecal water. I first heard the words free fecal water at an equine nutrition conference in Dijon back in 2016, and I honestly didn't think I'd hear much about it again because it felt like one of those odd niche things that I'd file away under interesting but rare. And I feel like maybe in Australia it is relatively rare, but fast forward to the American Association of Equine Practitioners Convention, or the AAEP, in Denver, Colorado in 2025, and suddenly it felt like free fecal water was everywhere. There were entire sessions on it. In table topic series we did, vets were asking us a bunch of questions about it, and recently I've had vets and horse owners emailing to ask how to feed a horse with it and what on earth they can do to make it stop. Which leaves me wondering, as I often do, what we have done in our horse's modern day management to cause this. And the answer to that question is hard to find, unfortunately, because free fecal water is so confusing. Your horse can pass normal formed manure, but then you get this watery liquid running out before, during, or after they poop. It is messy, it burns and irritates their skin, it creates constant washing and extra duties in your horse's care. And let's face it, none of us need extra duties when it comes to our horse's care. And it comes with that nagging worry that something more serious is going on in your horse's gut. Despite researchers' efforts, we still don't have a clean answer for why it happens. It's almost certainly a multifactorial syndrome, meaning it's going to be a number of things stacking up and not just one smoking gun. Forage type and changeovers from one forage type to another, the fibre variety in your horse's diet, grain load, grain digestibility, sand irritation, ulcers, and even nitrate levels in hay. All of these can play a role depending on your horse and your horse's specific situation. So in this episode, I am going to walk you through what we do know, or at least what we think we know, what we don't know yet, and some of the low-hanging fruit of the practical, sensible steps you can try first in logical order to help your horse with free fecal water or to prevent it happening to your horse in the first place without falling into the internet cure rabbit hole on this one, because that rabbit hole is big with a lot of branches. Okay. So let's start with what free fecal water actually is and what it isn't. So to give you a definition of free fecal water, I turned to the Merck Veterinary Manual. And what I found almost immediately that free fecal water is also called free fecal liquid. And I just thought, well, of course it is. It's a horse condition, and so rarely can we have one name for a horse condition. So I tend to call it free fecal water because that's what I first got to know the condition as, but it's the same thing if you call it free fecal liquid, it is the same condition. So the Merck Veterinary Manual describes it as, and I quote, a condition in which horses produce normal manure, but before, during or after defecation, watery feces runs from the anus. End of quote. So the manual describes it as a syndrome that is concerning for owners but not associated with infectious causes of diarrhea, with the biggest issue, they point out, being the watery feces causing the skin irritation. And I know that anyone that does have a horse with free fecal water and also a horse with diarrhea, you can attest to the mess and the skin issues that do happen. And I think probably one of the interesting things from the Merck Veterinary Manual definition that occurred to me is that they say, they're sort of talking about it more as it's a nuisance. Yeah, your horse has got this condition where their manure is normal, but then there's all this watery feces that comes out as well, and it goes all over their legs and it burns their skin. And the veterinary manual gives, ideas for how to control the skin irritation, but it's never spoken about much in terms of it actually being a problem for the horse or being an indicator of a problem. And I do feel like that is starting to change in the scientific community. We're looking at it less as a nuisance, as a messy condition, but doesn't actually have a negative impact on the horse, because the horses with free fecal water, they don't have an infectious diarrhea. They are not typically unwell in any other way. They just have this watery feces. And so I think it's always been put into the basket of, well, it's a nuisance, but let's not worry about it too much, other than the fact that it affects the skin on your horse's legs and makes an awful mess of their tail. But I'd like to suggest that that's probably not the right attitude to have. And it's also what I see too. The industry is starting to question, why do these horses have this condition? What is it that we've done to their gut to make the solid fraction of the manure separate out from the liquid fraction? So it is a confusing condition. And my PhD was looking at the impact of grain on hindgut health. So usually in my mind, I'm able to sort of logically figure things out that might be going on in the hindgut and see the patterns of where a problem may start or end, or, things that might cause that problem. But to me, it really makes no logical sense why the solid and the liquid fraction separates in the feces of these horses. But I do think that it is telling us that there's something not right in the hindgut. And for any of you who have been listening to the podcast for quite some time, you'll know that I like to think of nutrition in terms of a horse's evolution, and the fact that for 99.99% of their time on Earth, of their 55 million years on Earth, humans have not been involved in their lives. So we were not controlling where they lived, where they slept, where they drank, where they ate. So they've got this ancient gut that has evolved in free-ranging animals that were able to select and choose their diet at will, because they were able to travel over such large areas throughout a 12-month period, throughout all of the seasons, and select what they're eating. And I can't help but think that the fact that we now have our horses often confined, often on very restricted forage diets, and restricted both in terms of quantity and also variety, I think that that's got to have something to do with the fact that we're seeing so much more free fecal water. And the other thing that makes me think that is, and any Aussies listening to this podcast, if you think that I'm wrong on this, I'd love to know, but it's not a condition that I've actually dealt with a whole lot in my career. And there's an awful lot of horses that I've dealt with in my career. So I get the feeling that we just don't see it here very much. And in fact, I was just before I started recording this podcast speaking to a vet from one of our bigger thoroughbred breeding farms here in Australia. And I asked her, I said, do you see this condition? And she said, no, very rarely. So their horses are on pasture-based systems, as a majority of our Australian horses are. So there's not a whole lot of horses in Australia that don't get access to some sort of free turnout and pasture access. And it makes me wonder whether this is a condition more of horses that are either kept in very cold climates, and therefore over the winter period when there's snow covering the ground, they are fed conserved forages, or a disease of more intensively managed horses, so horses that are intensively managed mostly in barns or stables, and then they're, fed hay that is either not necessarily limited amount, but a limited diversity, so, only one or two different types of hay. I've just completely jumped the gun on my theories here, but I just wanted to bring in that piece of having you think about what is it that we've done in our horses' management that is not sitting well in their ancient gut. What have we changed so dramatically from the way that they evolved to eat to the way we feed them now that is causing this condition and also other gut health conditions? And in fact, one of the research papers on free fecal water, so Lindroth et al. In 2020, they actually note that horses with free fecal water also have a higher risk of colic when compared to a normal population of horses. And we know that horses with colic also are more likely to have a disturbed microbiome. And we'll talk about the microbiome piece a little bit more as we go along in this podcast. But just keep all of that rattling around in the back of your mind. What is it in the way that we manage horses in our modern day that is not working well for their ancient guts? And what part of that is then predisposing certain horses to this free fecal water syndrome? Okay. So we know what free fecal water is now. Now let's have a look at what causes free fecal water. And it's unfortunately a question that I can't answer because we don't fully know the answer. We've got some ideas, but it seems that depending on the horse, the cause may well be different. So, and this is where it comes down to it being this multifactorial syndrome, where it's not caused by one thing. And, there'll be horses in exactly the same situation. So, you may have a barn of 40 horses on essentially the same feed, and you'll have 2 horses in that barn that have free fecal water. And we don't know why those horses have free fecal water and yet the other horses don't have free fecal water. So it's something about the horse itself, and it will be something about that horse's, something about that horse's microbial blueprint that it has. So the microbes that it's damn taught it while in utero are the good microbes to keep in your gut. So if you have a horse that is born to a dam that had a disturbed microbiome, then that foal is also going to have the blueprint for a disturbed microbiome. So there is all these things, all of these host and environment interactions. So the horse interacting with its environment that will then give rise to conditions like free fecal water, which, explains why a majority of horses in a certain situation are okay, but a couple will end up with this condition. My observation is that some horses will have this condition persistently and others will have it intermittently. So some will get it and then it seems to resolve, but then they'll get it again. And others just seem to have it the whole time. And again, there's lots of factors that play into that. So, some horses will get it in springtime when the grass is lush and green, and so they're in a situation where their environment is actually changing. Perhaps the horses that have got it persistently are horses that are managed in a barn or stable, and they're getting the same type of hay year round, and therefore nothing's really changing in that aspect of their diet, and therefore the free fecal water is more persistent. There's just seemingly no one common thread between, or not that I've been able to see, in horses with free fecal water. Like I said, it's not a condition that I've worked with a lot, and this is actually a little bit of an odd podcast for me to do because I'm working very much from the experience. I mean, I do have some experience, but it is limited, so I'm working from the experience of others and from what I saw and heard at the recent AAEP convention, and also in reading a number of research papers in this area as well, and also the information that I remember from that 2016 conference in Dijon, France, where I first heard about it. So you'll have to bear with me while I muddle through all of the information that I've cobbled together for the podcast. So forage is a big one in terms of, I'll go through now and have a look at some of the factors that feed into causing free fecal water in horses. And forage is a big one, but the way that it is involved really isn't clear. So what I mean by that is that in, say, Lindroth's study in 2020 in European horses, they found that horses, when they were switched from wrapped forage, so from haylage or silage across to hay, their free fecal water improved. And if that was the only result they'd found, you'd be going, great, it's got something to do with wrapped forages. Wrapped forages have got a really high microbial load because that is the nature of them. They're fermented typically, not always, but they are often fermented. And they're high moisture forages, and for some reason, some horses eating those forages don't cope with it and they get free fecal water, but if we just change them onto hay, they get better. That would be a really simple answer. But in that same study, they found that if you change some horses from hay to haylage, they improved. So going back the other way, or if you went from haylage to pasture, they improved. So it didn't seem to be the forage type as such that made the improvement. It was more to do with the forage change. And this is really interesting to me because there's a wonderful vet in the States, Dr. Jen, very holistic veterinarian, and I absolutely love watching her brain work on cases. And Dr. Jen ended up in an AAEP presentation that I was doing online. I can't remember what they were called. It's like Wednesday roundtables or something like that. And she has this client, Dougie, the horse, and he has persistent free fecal water. And so Dr. Jen and I were chatting after that. This is, it must be nearly 12 months ago. We were chatting backwards and forwards about Dougie. And one of the things that stood out to me in Dougie's diet was that he was just on one type of hay. His diet was good. There was no overload of grain, which we'll talk about in a minute, or anything, there wasn't any other red flags for me for a horse to have free fecal water, but he was just on one type of forage. And I said to Dr. Jen, maybe we try just increasing some fibre diversity, because I do believe, and you will hear me talk about this a lot, that getting more fibre diversity into our modern day horses' diets is incredibly important, because when they were out and roaming free and grazing whatever they could come across, their fibre diversity in their diet was massive. And that fibre diversity gives rise to microbial diversity. And then when we've got a more diverse population of microbes, number one, they're more stable, so they're less easily knocked into dysbiosis or out of balance and, tip towards undesirable bacteria that we don't want in the gut. And the second aspect is that when we've got those diverse microbes in the horse's hindgut, it's more likely that they'll be doing all of the jobs that they're meant to be doing for our horses. So a massive percentage of a horse's immune system sits inside their gut, and those microbes are responsible for breaking down and digesting all kinds of fibres. They're responsible for producing vitamins. They're responsible for producing hormones like dopamine and serotonin. They are incredibly important, and unless we maintain the diversity of those microbes in our horse's hindgut, we don't get the full benefit of the microbiome. So we don't have all of the species that a horse should have to carry out that full range of functions that a really healthy microbiome will carry out. And my suspicions are that when horses are on just one type of forage, we do start to favour certain microbes, and we will start to lose the microbe diversity and also the evenness of distribution, which I talk about a little in episode number 9 of the Happy Horse Nutrition podcast with Dr. Belinda, where we talk about everything microbiome and all of the things that it does to support your horse's health. So if you're interested in digging into the microbiome a lot more, go and have a listen to episode 9 if you haven't already, and there's a wealth of information there from Dr. Belinda. So back to Dougie, I said to Dr. Jen, why don't we just try and introduce at least one other forage to him and we'll see what happens. So they took alfalfa and they very slowly introduced it into Dougie's diet, and amazingly, his free fecal water resolved. So for the first time in I don't know how long, he actually had normal manure and no free fecal water. But then he was in a barn, a large barn with lots of horses, and he was accidentally fed the wrong feed, and that triggered his free fecal water again. And then he stayed in that condition. So it returned and it didn't go away. And I just checked in on him about a week ago, and they said, yeah, it's just he never came back. I don't think he's as bad as he was, but he didn't get back to being as good as he was when they introduced the alfalfa in. And this got me thinking more about how horses eat in their natural environment. And I thought, you know what? It is such an unnatural thing for horses to be fed these same types of forage all of the time. And I had the information from Lind Rotherdale's study bumping around in my back of my head going, it wasn't the type of forage that improved the free fecal water, it was the change of forage. So it didn't really seem to matter what they changed from or to. In at least some horses, they still saw an improvement. And I'm adding all of this up in my mind as I do, thinking about nutrition constantly. And I thought, well, I wonder if there's anything in the fact that in the wild, horses will be eating different plant species throughout a 12-month period because we go through 4 seasons. We don't have the same forages all of the time. And, I know for my own horses where we've just entered our autumn or our fall period, and I can see my pastures starting to change as we go through autumn, and then we'll go through a winter period when it's really quite cold and we get down to freezing most nights, and the pasture will change again. And then as spring starts to approach and the day length gets longer and the days start to get warmer, we get a massive change in pasture again. And then as we go through our hot, dry summers, again, different pasture. So at least 4 distinct times of the year, my own horses, being grazing horses and living out on pasture, they're experiencing these different forages all the time. And this is exactly what our wild horses would have experienced as well, except my horses are restricted in where they can roam, so they're not exactly as a wild horse, but they definitely get this change in forage type. Now, you compare that to a horse that is in a barn on Timothy hay and alfalfa hay, or, orchard grass hay and Bermuda grass hay, and year round, that is what they're on. And I think, I wonder if that's a part of it. I wonder if that's a piece of this puzzle. So if you are listening to this and you have got a horse with free fecal water, have a little bit of a ponder about, one, how much forage variety your horse has or doesn't have in their diet, and how you might be able to introduce in a new forage. And then, so what we've done with Dougie now, and I'll have to try and remember to do an update on this series, I've said to Dr. Jen, I wonder what will happen if we found a third type of hay and introduce that now. And I'm starting to wonder, what would happen in these horses if we start to do seasonal shifts of forages and, not leaving them on the same forage all the time, but introducing some in and taking some out and try to... This is completely... I've never said this stuff out loud before. I'm just making this stuff up as I go. So take it or leave it. But I do think there's got to be... We know there is something in trying to mimic a horse's natural diet. We know that we get the best results with horses when we, as closely as possible, try to mimic their natural diet. Lots of forage variety, limited amounts of grain, all of that stuff that I talk about all the time. So I just think that, we're seeing that free fecal water horses improve when their forage changes, and it changes from hay to haylage, or from haylage to hay, or from haylage to pasture. You're getting a response, an improvement in free fecal water. It makes me wonder whether, is it in the change? So number one with these horses, make sure they're getting enough forage and, around that 2% of body weight per day. Number two is make sure that they've got at least some forage variety, and as much forage variety as you possibly can, to try and improve the fibre diversity and the microbiome diversity. And if you're trying those things and you still can't get on top of the free fecal water, or if you notice, like with Dougie, we put a new forage in and he improves, but then he regresses again, and we'll see what happens when we put a different forage in. I've also seen this in a little horse in Australia that I was helping out with. His name's Flea. He doesn't have free fecal water, but he's had persistent diarrhea for as long as Mel has owned him. And the same sort of thing happened. We put all of these different fibres in his diet, and for the first time ever, he had formed manure balls, but then he regressed slightly. So I'm going to have a bit of a play around with his diet as well, and just see, well, what happens if we change things up a little bit? What happens if we bring in another hay, or what happens if we take out one hay and replace it with a different hay, and just try and, mimic, I guess, the seasonal changes in forage that horses grazing in the wild would have experienced for their millions of years of evolution. Okay, enough on that. The next potential factor that may be causing free fecal water is the horse's overall diet. So we know that what we feed has a massive impact on hindgut health. And so whenever you're working with a horse with free fecal water, we have to be thinking about, well, how is diet in general affecting their hindgut? So big red flags in this space are too much grain. So if a horse with free fecal water is getting any more than 0.5 kilogram per 100 kilograms of body weight, or 0.5 pound per 100 pounds of body weight in grain per day, I would suggest that you look at reducing that amount, or even taking it out altogether to see if you can stabilise them on a diet that doesn't have grain in it. It's particularly dangerous when the grain is indigestible. So an indigestible grain is going to be essentially any grain, with the exception of oats, that hasn't been properly cooked or heat treated in some way before feeding. So if you are struggling with a horse with free fecal water and that horse is on a grain-based diet, go and pay attention to how much you are feeding, and also how digestible those grains are likely to be. And if either you're feeding too much, or you're feeding a feed that is likely to have reasonably indigestible starch, so extruded grains and boiled grains are going to be your most digestible, and popped, if you're lucky enough to have access to popped grains. Very well steam flaked and properly micronized grains, where they're micronized with water being added at the start of the process so that the grains are quite wet when they're being micronized, are also very digestible. So yeah, just pay attention to how much grain is being fed and what the likely digestibility is. And if either there's too much grain or the digestibility is likely to be poor, then you should definitely change that in your horse's diet. Even go to just a fibre-based diet and take grain out altogether to see if that helps with the free fecal water. I say that in the back of my mind. I do remember a case of a horse, and this kind of plays into the change in fibre as opposed to the type of fibre. But I remember a case of a horse with free fecal water, and the owner took some wheat bran and added it to the diet, and the free fecal water resolved. Now, I can't explain that other than that was a different fibre going into the horse's hindgut. And for whatever reason, that has helped balance out whatever is going on in there, and it resolved. I'd love to know if it stayed resolved or whether it has also regressed like Dougie did. But yeah, I distinctly remember that there was just a small amount, and it's a grain-based ingredient. So it's not to say that grains cause this, but certainly if you're putting too much starch into the hindgut by feeding grain incorrectly, you are going to be unbalancing the horse's hindgut microbiome. And that's not good in any situation. And it's certainly not going to be helping if a horse has got free fecal water. And then the other aspects of the diet are, we've already spoken about, not enough forage or not enough fibre diversity. So they are both, as I've already said, high on my list of potential causes for free fecal water. The next cause is the microbiome. So this is a big space that I don't think we have explored much at all in terms of horses with free fecal water. So there is lots of conflicting published research in this space, which doesn't help when we're trying to figure out what is actually going on. But there's some studies that show there is differences in microbiome between horses with free fecal water, and there are others showing that horses with and without free fecal water have no significant difference in microbiome. So there's a beautiful paper by Wester et al. Published in the Nature Journal in 2024 that showed that there was no significant difference between horses. I think there was 14 horses with free fecal water and 11 control horses that didn't have free fecal water. And they found no difference in their microbiome. But the thing I'd like to point out here, and thank you to Dr. Belinda for ruining every microbiome paper in horses almost that there is for me. But the thing I want to point out here is that most of these papers in this Wester et al. Paper included are only describing the microbiome from a reasonably high level. So they're not looking at the microbes at a species level. They're looking at them, and I'll use the technical terms, but then I'll explain what they mean. So they're looking at them from the phylum, the class, and the order level. So when we look at bacteria, there's all these classifications that are applied to the bacteria. So when we talk about bacterial classification, we have the domain, which is these are bacteria. And then we can work down through the phylum, class, order, family, genus, and then we get to the species. So we only get to who they actually are at, what is that, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 levels down. And the paper, the Wester paper that says they found no significant difference, they were only looking at the bacteria from phylum, class, and order. And the best way I can think of to explain that to you is the phylum level would be like saying to someone, let's say that you are going on a massive four-wheel drive trip. Let's say we're driving to the tip of Cape York in Australia, a trip that I haven't done but I would love to do. And it is definitely a four-wheel drive trip. You cannot get to the tip of Cape York unless you have a four-wheel drive. Now, if you were shopping for a car, but a vehicle, so a four-wheel drive to go and do that trip, but you needed someone else to buy that vehicle for you, if you just spoke at the phylum level of vehicles, you would just say to someone, can you go and buy me a car? I'm doing a trip. Okay. But when you think about car as a classification, it is so broad. So, a four-wheel drive that would be suitable for doing this trip is a very different thing to, a tiny little hatchback that would be brilliant for zipping around town for a teenager on their provisional license, right? So when we describe bacteria at phylum, we're essentially just grouping all cars into the same category. Now, you might get a little bit more prescriptive and say, I want a four-wheel drive, and that would be like speaking at the class level. So we've got phylum first, and then we come down to class. So we might say, I need a car, it has to be a four-wheel drive. Now, if you don't specify what type of four-wheel drive, there are massive differences again in four-wheel drives. I'm not necessarily a big car person, but when I was trying to think through how to explain this, it seemed to make sense to me that it's like, classifying cars. Now, it would get you a better result and you would be able to see more differences. So if we start to separate out two-wheel drives from four-wheel drives, we can definitely start to see a grouping and we can start to see differences. But I think you'll all agree that the grouping of four-wheel drive is still really broad. Now, if we got down to order, you might say that you want a Toyota four-wheel drive, which is great, except that if you're taking a family of 7 and someone comes back with a 2-seater Toyota Land Cruiser, it's not really going to fit your purpose. So there's still a lot of description missing when we describe vehicles at that, the make. So we've got car, it's a four-wheel drive, it's a Toyota. So we've gotten down to the make. We don't have the model, we don't have the year, we don't have the number of seats, we don't have any of that really important information that is going to allow us to really figure out what vehicle is going to be the right one. And if we were to go and classify vehicles out on the road as like four-wheel drive Toyotas or not, if we lined up all of the four-wheel drive Toyotas, and I hope this is resonating with people who are not in Toyota crazy countries like Australia. They're everywhere here, and I know they're in lots and lots of places in the world, but we have multiple different types of four-wheel drive Toyotas. It's still really hard to see if that was all we were talking about, that was the only level we were talking about, we still wouldn't really be able to separate out many differences between those vehicles. And it's the same as when we're talking about bacteria, just at that phylum, class, and order level. So what I'm trying to say is that these published studies, when they're only looking at the bacterial species in those really broad terms, they're saying that there is no difference between horses with free fecal water and horses without free fecal water. But I don't think we can say that yet because we haven't dug down into the family, the genus, or the species. So to give you a little bit of an idea of, because some of you will have heard these terms. So in this situation, let's use an example. So we've got the domain is bacteria. So we're talking about bacteria. And then if we went down to phylum, we might say, okay, so they're firmicutes. And then go down to class in that phylum and we find the class of Clostridia. And this is all that paper is looking at is and then they do go down to order. So they go firmicutes, Clostridia, and then an order might be Clostridiales. But then they stop at that point. So they're only comparing horses at that really high level. If we keep going down that tree for this particular grouping of bacteria, we might get to a family of Lachnospiraceae, and then we might get to a genus of Rosburia, and then we might get to the species of Rosburia intestinalis. So there is so much detail that these published papers are not reporting on yet. And I think if we are measuring as we can now, the bacteria and also the fungi at species level, I truly believe that we will find differences in horses with free fecal water syndrome and horses without. So be really careful in interpreting the science that is currently available for horses in free fecal water, because while they're showing that there is no difference between horses at those higher levels of classification for bacteria, we're not actually looking at them in species level. This is what has been so amazing in working with Dr. Belinda and her EquiGI analyses, is that they are testing everything at species level. So we can see I've been working with a couple of horses with, again, not free fecal water syndrome, but persistent and chronic diarrhea. And there's two horses nowhere near each other, like thousands of kilometres apart in location, and yet they share 17 of the top 30 microbial species, and the second most dominant bacterial species in their gut is the same. It's a mucus-eating bacteria. So I don't think that's coincidence. I think once we start looking at microbes at the species level, I do think we will start to find differences in horses with free fecal water syndrome. So it's very much a watch this space. We have so much to learn. There is so much we don't know. And if you do have a horse with free fecal water syndrome and you would like to get it tested, it is definitely possible. I'll put the link to the lab that can test down to species level for you in the show notes. And it would be fascinating if we started to test a bunch of horses with free fecal water to see if we can see the patterns of what is going on in their microbiome. I could talk about microbes all day, as you probably know, but I will move on. So there's one very simple factor that may be at play here. And in fact, I have seen this in one of my horses. Poet is 22 now, so it would have been like 21 years ago. We lived on a very, very sandy property, and he broke his top jaw. That's what happened. He actually stuck his mouth through a gate and then got a fright, and he literally just snapped his top jaw. The vets that stitched him and screwed him back together had never seen a horse do it before. And so for it must have been 6 to 8 weeks. He wasn't actually allowed to graze. So I had to have him locked in this yard area, and he could only eat hay. And I did my best to keep his hay off the sand. But man, it was nearly impossible to do that with rubber matting and carpeting, and we'd keep it in buckets and tubs and stuff. But, him being him, and the boisterous young boy that he was back then, he would just tip everything everywhere, and it was nearly impossible. So he did end up getting a lot of sand accumulation in his gut. And I wouldn't have had the words back then to classify it as free fecal water, but it was certainly runny, weird diarrhea that he had. And then when I treated him for sand accumulation, it resolved and went back to normal manure really quickly. So sand is definitely something that you should rule out if you've got a horse with free fecal water, and keep your fingers crossed that it is something that is that simple. But anyone who has spent time at a beach and you have worn wet shorts that have had sand all over them for too long, you know very well how abrasive sand is. And it's no different in a horse's gut. So when you get sand and dirt, I've had this happen with my horses just in drought conditions, so it doesn't need to be what you would classify as sand. It can also be dirt accumulation. It essentially just gets into the gut and rubs around in the hindgut, causes abrasion, and then you'll see this watery diarrhea or free fecal water that might be caused by it. So best thing to do is work closely with your vet on this one. They can actually do ultrasounds. I know that the sand in the manure test is the classic one, but to my logical way of thinking, it's probably not really going to tell you very much, because if the sand is stuck in the gut, it's not coming out. So you're not necessarily going to see it in that water bucket test where you get your horse's manure and put it in water and stir it around and see how much sand is on the bottom. You're not necessarily going to see that there is sand accumulated in your horse's gut using that test, because if it was coming out of the gut, as it will in natural circumstances when there's enough fibre to push it through the gut, it will come out. But if it was coming out, it's probably not going to be accumulating. So don't use that as your be-all and end-all test of whether there's sand in the gut. They can ultrasound, your vet can ultrasound and look for the sand. And they can also help you with the correct treatment. So I personally always just used psyllium husk and have managed to resolve a bunch of sand accumulation cases over the years with psyllium husk. And I haven't said this dose rate for a long time, but I think I used to use 50 grams of psyllium husk per 100 kilograms of body weight. So for a 500 kilogram horse or for an 1,100 pound horse, it was 250 grams of psyllium and just given in one meal, mixing it in. Don't wet it too much. Mix it in with something that your horse finds very palatable, because it doesn't smell and I imagine doesn't taste very nice. Mix it into their feed and let them eat it just in one go. The published research shows that using psyllium husk and also Epsom salts that are nasogastric tubed over a number of consecutive days, it's a veterinary procedure, is very, very effective at removing sand from the gut. So if your horse does have big issues with sand accumulation, definitely work with your vet on that one to get it out of their gut for them, and then you should see that a lot of those symptoms resolve. Now, there are some researchers, and the wonderful Nana Lutherson is one of them, who's done a lot of research in the gastric ulcer space, report that in their experience, free fecal water will often resolve in horses with gastric ulceration once the ulcers are treated, which is a really interesting observation. So if your horse does have free fecal water, it would be worth, as so many horses have gastric ulceration because of the way we feed them and the way we manage them, their gut is really not designed at all to be domesticated. I was watching some sheep the other day. My partner Ryan has just moved into a new place, and the sheep that were owned by the previous owners have stayed there because they've moved into a town and they couldn't take their small flock of pet sheep with them. And it's bad drought conditions out where they are at the moment. So these funny little sheep come up every day for some lucerne hay. And I kid you not, we'd fed them the lucerne hay on Saturday night. And on Sunday morning, they're still lying around exactly where we'd fed them. The hay was gone probably 12 hours previously. And yet they're still content there chewing their cud. And being ruminants, they don't have this gastric stomach that we need to worry about, because the rumen is their massive first stomach, if you like, and they put all of their food into there and they just kind of chow it down. They don't really bother chewing it properly even, and then over a number of hours they'll regurgitate all of that food that they scoffed down really quickly, and it just slowly flows from their rumen into their stomach and then on further down in their gastrointestinal tract. And I've just walked out and seen them all lying there. I was like, oh my goodness, life would be so much easier as a horse owner if horses were ruminants, because we wouldn't have to be worried about making sure that they have forage available all the time, making sure that, there's no periods of longer than 4 hours where they don't have forage, so that their stomach doesn't empty and they get that massive acid accumulation that then goes and eats holes in the top part of their stomach. It's a very inconvenient design of gastrointestinal tract for domestication, but it is the one that we have, and it is the one that we need to work with, and the one that we need to be really aware of, and the one that we need to feed so that we don't unknowingly cause these painful conditions for our horses. So all that to say, gastric ulcers are such a common condition. So even if you think that your management has been good enough to prevent gastric ulceration in your horses, maybe your horse does still have gastric ulcers. So if you've got free fecal water that is not resolving with other changes in the diet, then it is probably worth considering that they may have gastric ulcers as well, and going down that diagnostic path. Definitely having a look in their stomach to see if they do have ulceration before you treat it, if at all possible. It is becoming so much more common these days to be able to scope our horses. So if you can get a horse with free fecal water scoped, it seems like it's probably a good idea if the easier things are not working. So if you're changing forage sources and increasing fibre diversity and making sure that there's no sand accumulated and feeding in a way that is going to support their microbiome, all of those things, if none of that helps to resolve the free fecal water, then having a look to see whether your horse does have gastric ulcers is a good idea. The last little potential cause that I've got in here is to be aware of nitrate. So nitrate is naturally present in a horse's forage. So plants, when they're alive and growing, will suck nitrogen out of the soil. They need nitrogen to create protein, so they'll suck nitrogen out of the soil in the form of nitrate. And then certain weather conditions, so if you've got, and today I'm just looking outside, is perfect high nitrate conditions, windy and overcast. So if you get windy and overcast days, nitrates can accumulate. Nitrate will be highest first thing in the morning in pastures. So if you've got, say, a a horse that is prone to laminitis and you're only allowing them to graze very early in the morning, I really hate to do this to you, but nitrate is something that you should be aware of, something else to worry about, you say, because nitrate is taken up by the plant overnight, but they won't make protein out of it until they have got the photosynthesis happening in their leaves when the sun is out. So they will actually accumulate nitrate overnight and then they'll use it up during the day. So always first thing in the morning, nitrates are highest in a plant. And then if you happen to have hay that has been harvested with high nitrate and then you're feeding that to your horse consistently, it will also be an issue because it's been in the plant when they've cut it for hay and then it's now been baled into your hay. And the reason I say beware of nitrate is because nitrate is really irritating in the gut. And some horses will be able to handle it and others won't. So for horses prone to free fecal water, I really recommend you use hay that has either been tested, and my limit for these horses, because they probably have a gut that is a little more sensitive than other horses, is a maximum of 500 parts per million of nitrate. And you do need to be really careful what figure your lab is reporting or the test results are reporting, because they'll either be reported as nitrate, which we want less than 500 parts per million or less than 500 milligrams per kilogram. It might also be reported out as well. Or they might report it as nitrate nitrogen. And to convert nitrate nitrogen to nitrate, you multiply by 4.43. Or just look for a hay that has got less than 110 parts per million of nitrate nitrogen. But do just be really wary that you're not reading nitrate nitrogen and thinking it's nitrate, because it's more than 4 times lower than the actual nitrate level. There are a bunch of labs that can test nitrate for you. So Equianalytical in the USA can definitely do this. There will be a heap of labs in Europe. If you're in Australia, you can test this through Feed Test in Victoria or through Feed Central in Queensland. Both labs will do this analysis for you. I think for me is becoming the single most important forage analysis result that I'm interested in, because it affects so many things. But speaking specifically about free fecal water, it's an irritant in the gut, and we don't want things that are irritating your horse's gut when the horse has got free fecal water. So if your horse has got free fecal water, go and test your hay. If you've got a bunch of hay, be really, really careful with nitrogen-based fertilizers. So lean really hard on a very good agronomist to advise you if you need to put nitrogen on, how much, and then when it will be safe to graze after your nitrogen fertilizer application. And if I was you and you're putting nitrogen on, I would also take a sample of the pasture and just check and see what the nitrate levels are in the pasture first thing in the morning before you actually allow your horses to graze. There's so much to know, isn't there? In domesticating horses and feeding them the way we feed them. And if you have got the luxury of buying hay that has got a nitrate analysis done on it, that's brilliant. Do that. And I really do wish that every hay was sold with a nitrate analysis, because it would just make things so much easier for us horse people. Okay. Let's move on to what to do if your horse does have free fecal water. There is absolutely no guarantee with any treatment for free fecal water. It's a matter of trying things and seeing what might work for your horse. But here are some things you can try, starting with the easiest ones first and moving down to the more complicated ones. So the first one would be, and we've talked about this a lot, so I won't spend a lot of time on it again, but changing your forage source. So if your horse is on hay, try and find a different hay to try. And you can either introduce a new hay, or you could take one hay out and put another hay in. Like I said, the more different types of hay in your horse's diet, the better. So my preference would be to introduce at least one, but if not multiple new hays into that diet. And if you find that your horse stabilizes for a period of time, but then reverts back to having free fecal water after a period of time, try changing it up again and just see what happens, just to see if, some of that shift over time in forage source will actually help keep their gut more stable. If you've got horses that are predominantly on hay, but you also have pasture available, allowing them more time out on pasture if it's available and if it's safe and suitable for them to eat might help. just mess around knowing that we do see in published research improvements in horses when we change their forage. Mess around and see what changes in forage you can make that may or may not help your horse with free fecal water. Make sure you are feeding enough forage. So for me, I always want horses to have 24/7 access to pasture or hay. But if you do need to restrict their forage, and sometimes you do because, if you're feeding your horses just hay, there are some horses that will just go and eat so much hay. If you need to restrict their forage, make sure you do it in a way that your horse still has constant access to the forage and is still fed a minimum of 2% of their body weight in forage per day. So say for your, classic overweight, cressy-necked, laminitic pony, and you're trying to get weight off them, instead of restricting the amount of forage you're feeding right down, restrict the quality of their forage down. So you can still give them some good quality hay, but also, introduce in amounts of straw or very low quality grassy hay so that they're still getting the bulk in their diet. There is a school of thought in free fecal water horses to unload their gut, and there were recommendations that I heard to take horses back to just pelleted forage and no long stem forage at all. But I really would hope that we can resolve horses with free fecal water without going to that extent in their diet, because they're so wired to chew, and they're so wired to chew long stem forage. So while we might be able to get an improvement in some horses with free fecal water by doing that, I think that the damage we do from a psychological stress perspective, because it's very stressful for horses when they don't have access to forage to chew all the time, I think the damage we do in that respect outweighs any benefit we might have in the gut by changing to a diet like that. If you're under veterinary advice to do that, then I don't want to counteract that, but do think through really carefully what else can be done before you get to that stage of having to take a horse back to a solely pelleted diet. And think about, the other aspects of their health that are not supported by a diet like that before you make that, because it's such a dramatic change. As I've said already, introduce fibre variety. So it is a really unnatural state for horses to be on just one or two different forages, remembering that, that when they evolved, they were eating, and horses in the wild, studies show now they eat 50 different types of forage and browse and forb and shrub over the course of a 12-month period. So having them constantly on one or two different types of forages is so limited. And that limited forage diversity limits their microbiome diversity, and then that loss of diversity in their microbiome will come at a cost. We don't fully understand the full cost of that loss of microbiome, but we certainly see the changes in behaviour and the changes in immune function and the changes in performance that we see when we restrict that microbiome diversity down, not to mention the increased risk of diseases like colic. And I think eventually we will see the microbiome at the root cause of free fecal water in some way, in at least some of the cases of free fecal water that we see. You can remove grains and grain-based feeds even just for a short while to see if that does help. You could try some alternate fibres in the diet that will bring in more fibre diversity. So things like sugar beet pulp or copper meal, lupin hulls, soybean hulls, chia seeds, hemp hulls and hearts. All of these funky little ingredients add fibre diversity, and they will help to support your horse's microbiome diversity, which has wide-reaching health effects, and you might find also helps your horse with free fecal water. If you're listening to me suggesting all of these things you could do to help your horse with free fecal water, so making sure that there's enough forage and forage diversity and minimising grain and all of those things, and you're wondering how on earth are you going to keep track of all of that, this is a big part of why we built the My Happy Horse app. So it will actually track a gut health score for your horse. So you will be able to see whether you are feeding enough forage, whether you've got enough different types of forage and enough different types of fibres in your horse's gut. And it'll also give you big red flags if there is too much grain, or if you are feeding a type of grain that is likely to be affecting your horse's hindgut health. So don't stress too much about all of the numbers that I've just rattled off to you. You can simply put your horse into My Happy Horse, and the app now comes with a 7-day free trial. So if you want to just check your horse's diet, I highly recommend it. Jump onto the app and run your horse's current diet through and just see if there's anything that jumps out for you for any horses that have got free fecal water, any red flags it gives you, or low-hanging fruit, if you like, that you might be able to fix to help your horse resolve their free fecal water. If you suspect sand, then use psyllium husk to clear it. Work with your vet on that one. Try and reduce as much as possible any herd dynamic stress or other stresses as much as possible for affected horses. So it was interesting. I do remember from the presentation in Dijon in 2016, the study that they were presenting found that paint horses were more affected by free fecal water than other horses. And I don't know if it's just coincidence, but I have two coloured paints, but one's brown solid paint and Domino is this stunning black and white mare, and she is bottom of the pecking order in my herd. She didn't used to be when she was younger, but she is now well and truly the bottom of the pecking order. Everyone bosses her around, so I do have to be careful with her. She's not had free fecal water that I have observed ever, but I do have to be careful with her to make sure that when we feed, she's not getting bossed around, so that I reduce her stress as much as possible. So if you do have a horse with free fecal water and you feel like there are stresses in its herd, then do what you can to move horses around, or, put more hay feeding stations out or other water sources, or, make sure that there's not areas where they have to move through in their pasture or horses they have to walk past to get to their stall that are stressing them out, or, neighbours in a stabling environment are really important. Having horses in stables that can actually touch each other is really important from a stress perspective. So try and work to reduce stress as much as possible. And then if you've implemented all of those steps and nothing has worked, trying a fecal transplant may be something you can try and resolve the free fecal water in your horse. So studies again show varied responses. So in some studies they show that horses can essentially be cured from free fecal water when they have a fecal transplant. Other horses, they may improve for a short period of time, but then the free fecal water returns. And I have theories on that around, a horse has a certain blueprint for the microbiome that it is carrying. And so with those transient improvements, if we give a horse a healthy microbiome, it will have normal manure for a period of time, but then eventually its programming for what its microbiome should look like will take over, and it will revert back to its normal microbiome, and then you'll get the free fecal water back. That's my theory. But certainly it's worth trying. If you've got a horse with free fecal water and you're listening to this, I'm looking at that list of things that you could try and nothing else is working, then potentially doing a fecal transplant for that horse may be effective. That brings me to the end of what we think causes free fecal water, and I haven't spoken more from the veterinary perspective about, loading in the gut and things like that. There is schools of thought around that, but I guess my perspective on those things are a horse's gut was designed to carry a large forage load. So I don't think it's the cause of the problem, potentially, not making the hindgut to do so much work in terms of not have so much forage in it. Maybe that will make a difference, but still what's causing its inability to function as it normally should? I still think that there's a layer underneath that we need to be looking at. Why is the hindgut not able to be full of forage without the horse having free fecal water? So like I said, I haven't spoken much about that. It's more of a veterinary perspective, so certainly talk to your vets on that one. But to end, I guess I just want to leave you with the thought of whether the free fecal water is a disease of modern management, because so much of what we do in managing and feeding our horses doesn't honour their ancient gastrointestinal tract. So we've taken these creatures who used to roam widely, grazing all sorts of things over a 12-month period, and now typically we have them confined to reasonably small areas. We give them access to restricted amounts and variety of forage. We meal feed them cereal grains, and often the grain is inappropriate amounts and inappropriate forms. So there's all of these modern feeding and management practices that stack up to all sorts of issues in our horse's hindgut. And with the seeming increasing prevalence of free fecal water, I can't help but think that this condition is also one of our human-made issues created by how we currently feed our horses. So if you've got a horse with free fecal water, try to think outside the box in terms of what is it that you're doing with this particular horse that might be triggering this. Is it the forage? Is it the diet? Is it the microbiome? Is it sand? Is it gastric ulcers? Could it be nitrate? And then what are your best approaches for systematically trying different things to try and resolve the free fecal water? Again, just, starting with that change of forage source and also increasing the forage variety, making sure your horse is getting enough forage, taking grains out for a period of time to see if that helps, trying some alternate fibres, treating sand accumulation with your vet if you suspect sand accumulation, making sure that you're on top of herd dynamics and stress for that particular horse. And if you've implemented all of those steps, nothing else has worked, then trying a fecal transplant to see if that might work. So shifting our focus to feeding them in a way that mimics their natural feeding habits as much as possible, I think will give us some chance of seeing a reduction in the prevalence of free fecal water in our equine population. I would absolutely love to know, as I said, I don't have a lot of really hands-on experience with this condition. So if you try any of those things that we've talked about and see an improvement with your horse, I would absolutely love to know. Get in touch. You can find us over at myhappy.horse. And equally, if you have got a horse with free fecal water and you try all of these things and nothing seems to work, I would love to know that as well. And I'd love to put you in contact with Dr. Belinda and EquiGI, because gosh, it would be fascinating to do a microbiome analysis on those horses that we just can't resolve this condition in, to see what is actually going on in there and help us understand into the future how we might better help them. I really hope that has been useful to you if you've got a horse with free fecal water. I hope it's been interesting for you if you're at the end of this going, thank goodness I'm not dealing with that condition in my horse. But I hope that the information was interesting, and it will certainly help you to recognise a condition if one of your horses ever does end up with this condition. So as always, thank you so much for listening. Would absolutely love you to follow the Happy Horse Nutrition podcast, because it does help us get found by other people who would appreciate this information. And I will catch you next time. If you'd like to know more about the My Happy Horse virtual equine nutritionist, you can head on over to myhappy.horse. And also, while you're there, check out the Dr. Nerida AI, which is me in AI format. And that version of me is happy to answer your questions about horse nutrition 24/7. Thanks again, and we'll catch you soon.